Welcome to our fifth lecture, the one following Virtue Ethics. Today we're going to be talking about conscience. And conscience is a word that we use in popular lingo all the time. We talk about people who have a conscience, people who lack one, and we often use it as a convenient term to more or less indicate whether or not someone has behaved morally or not. Conscience is really the belief that each individual possesses an internal moral compass which serves to guide and correct behavior as well as forming one's moral character. I've used a number of analogies along the way. When we talked about the common good, I used the analogy of comparison shopping. When we talked about deontology, I used the analogy of a job description, standards against which we judge behavior. The mode of reasoning when we're talking about conscience is this kind of moral GPS, this thing within us that guides us and brings us to a conclusion that's moral or ethical. Conscience, what I want to do right off the bat is define what conscience is not, first of all. And conscience is not the Freudian idea of superego. If you remember, Freud had this idea that the psychological character was broken into various parts, one being the id, the other being the superego, and the third being the ego. The superego was the emotional internalization of external authorities. It was like the internalized parent that told you to brush your teeth and don't cross the street except when the light turns green, and don't steal from others, and these sorts of things that parents tell children that we internalize and then become socialized adults by externalizing those internal authorities. The id represents just the opposite of the internalized parent. The id is that emotional impulse inspired by basic natural appetites. So the id was that thing inside us that wanted the chocolate eclair and wants it right now. And it doesn't matter how much it costs, it doesn't matter how fat it will make me. I want that chocolate eclair and I want it now. So the id are those very instinctual, very animalistic forces. They may be sexual, they may be other appetites. Nevertheless, these are forces that are driving us. They are pre-reflective, precognitive, that is, we don't have to think about them. We know instinctively we just want this and we want this to happen. Finally, there's the ego, and the ego plays this arbiter role between the superego and the id. It arbitrates between the overly restrictive constraints of the superego and the overly licentious behavior of the id. It's the rational adult negotiating a reasonable compromise between the licentious id and the restrictive superego. So back to that chocolate eclair example, we walk into the sweet shop and we see chocolate eclair. The id is telling us buy, get as many of those chocolate eclairs as you can get, me want one now. And the superego is saying no, you can't have any of those. They are too expensive and they will make you fat and you do not need one, so you can't have any. Well, the ego steps in and says, wait a minute. Now, first of all, we obviously know we can't have every chocolate eclair, but we can have one. We have enough money, it's not going to break the bank, and it's not going to, make us fat or, give us too much of a sugar high. So the ego steps in and comes to some kind of reasonable or rational conclusion. Now, the closest conscience comes closest to ego, but really isn't the ego either. it is more closely allied to the ego because conscience is informed by our rational selves. It is informed by a cognitive process. It isn't just a pure instinct or pure reflex. Although conscience is an autonomous function of an individual's authority within the moral sphere, it is not entirely alienated from external authority. That is, in part, those who study conscience believe that it is informed at some level, say by parents or other authority figures like teachers, that it isn't entirely divorced from this. As Freud would have said that his ego was something entirely different than a parental influence or a teacher influence or some other authoritative influence. Those who work with conscience would say, well, no, that our conscience is formed by many different forces, and some of those are authoritative forces. External authority can play a positive role in forming and guiding our conscience. There are 3 dimensions of conscience, and some of these actually, although they're significantly different in that they are, they come before the psychological sciences and Freud. At some level, you may see some similarities between the dimensions of conscience and the dimensions of our psyche that were defined by Freud. The first dimension is synderesis, this instinctual moral capacity. It is immediate and visceral. It's the sense that something is wrong. Usually it's something is wrong. Sometimes it's also the sense that, wow, something is very right here or very good has happened. But synderesis usually comes into play when we walk into a situation and immediately we know something is wrong, or we hear of something and we say, oh, wait a minute, that's wrong. And we haven't thought about it yet. We haven't thought through it yet. We haven't asked why is it wrong, or how is this somehow problematic morally. And we haven't said, well, it's because, if people do this sort of thing, ultimately the consequences or results will be bad for the greater number of people. In other words, do a consequentialist analysis, a common good analysis in some ways. That's the second level of conscience. The first level of conscience is just this feeling something's wrong or right. I mean, synderesis does work when we encounter a situation that is altruistic or wonderfully ethical as well. An example of this, and this usually works when I say it in class, is that I have you imagine going to a store like Walmart and you're walking down the aisle, and from the other end of the aisle you see a mother and a child standing next to the mother, and the child has obviously done something to anger the mother, and the mother hauls off with a big swipe of her hand and smacks the child as hard as she can, and the child goes flying into the produce at the other side of the aisle. Now, immediately, most people say, something's really wrong here. They didn't have to think it through. We didn't have to go to any kind of analysis about it. At first glance, we realize something's wrong, and that's synderesis kicking in. It's not just that it's a shocking event. It's a shocking event with a moral character to it, with a moral condemnation attached to it. That child is being abused from most people's perspectives. The second step of these, or the second dimension of conscience, it's really kind of the second step, is moral science, something we've really been studying for the last few weeks now. It's an application of moral principles and practical moral reasoning. to a situation. We have the moment of synderesis. Synderesis tells us something is wrong. Then in the next moment we think it through to make sure. Because sometimes, usually synderesis is right on target. The 99% of the time, it's correct that there is something wrong. But sometimes we have these moments where we sensed immediately that something was wrong when, upon further reflection, upon gathering of new data, we realize things are either more ambivalent or not quite as problematic as we thought they were in the first place. And moral science is really the application of the kinds of theories we've been learning, like common good, like deontology, like virtue ethics. So all of those theories, all of those principles come into play when we get into the second step of conscience, which is moral science. And this whole course is really about giving you the kinds of resources you need to do good moral science, to do a good job in this second step of conscience. The final step of conscience, and this is the step that is key, and it's the step that is the difference between a conscience that is successful and one that has failed. And this is the moment of conscience when judgment leads to action. The most common moral failing is for a person not to follow the results of their moral science of step number 2. Usually people don't fail to have synderesis. Usually people don't actually fail to think through a situation on a practical level. Usually people fail to follow the results of that moral science, of that practical reasoning. And we can see this in most of the cases that we study in this class. But again, I want to go actually forward to the final case that we study in this class, which is the Enron case, the movie Enron, Smartest Guys in the Room. When we go to view that, or when you go to view that, keep in mind the idea of conscience and where so many people, not just one person like Jeff Skilling or one of the other executives, but almost everyone at Enron fails morally. They make the right. They recognize something is wrong. You'll hear it in the interviews, how everyone says, something was really wrong. We knew it. And we knew it because we'd thought through it. Step number 2, they thought through it and realized, something's wrong, but we were just making so much money. And everyone else seemed to be behaving that way. So what happened was they failed in step number 3. They failed to follow through on their conscience. And usually, when one fails in step number 3, it's usually a failure of virtue. That's why I teach virtue and conscience in the same week, because virtue is really following the third step of conscience, following through on what you know is right or know is wrong, and having the courage to do so, having the prudence to do so, having any of the other virtues, the honesty to do so. We could go through a whole long list of virtues, and you'd realize that they all have to do with this moment when we make a decision, a decision that leads to an action that usually means we have to take some kind of risk. Some kind of risk that may cost us our job, that may cost us our reputation, that may be a great sacrifice for us one way or the other. Formation of conscience. Our consciences can never be forced, but they can be formed. That is, this I think even brings us back to the beginning of our discussion about psychological factors. Our consciences can be formed by authority figures. They can be formed by our educational systems, they can be formed by our environment, they can be formed by other key people, not per se authority figures, but friends and close associates. Formative factors on the conscience are very important, and choosing the right formative factors, choosing the right friends, choosing the right authorities in our lives is very important. Because ultimately, when we choose these formative figures, we're not just choosing a way of life, we're choosing who we are, a character. Conscience is a major part of who we are as a character. Moral choices are fundamentally matters of integrity, is what the theory of conscience is trying to tell us. We act in character or out of character. And moral failures, what's often seen as a moral failure, is when we're in a situation and acting out of character. Now, we might not say that about someone who has been poorly formed or has a deformed character. Let's say somebody who is habitually a criminal in society. If we were to go to a prison, we might find somebody who, when they behaved in character, they were actually behaving very poorly and very immorally. But for most of us, when we behave in character, we're usually behaving in a way that is morally acceptable to the rest of society. It's when we behave out of character that it becomes surprising, sometimes even to ourselves. Character identifies the responsive orientation of a person, seeing the world as a hostile or a friendly place, as an essentially good place or an evil place, as a place that is there for my benefit, or as a place that's really there trying to cheat me out of something. It's being a person who loves and helps. It can also be a person who, hates and is obstructive as well. Being a person who may be fearful or selfish. It's a predisposition. It's not deterministic. And in the sense that in any given moment, we can always choose to be different, and we can always reform our character and reform our conscience. Nevertheless, most of us at a certain point in life have accrued enough experience and been exposed to enough formative elements in our lives that we have established a fairly firm character. That wasn't so when we were all maybe 5 years old or 10 years old. But now that we are adult, there's a way in which our character it's not concrete, but there is some kind of solidity to it. It's not entirely plastic. You can't turn me into a serial killer tonight. It's not possible, simply because of who I am and who I have become and how different my character is than, say, the serial killers. Character is a personal hermeneutic. That is, it's the kind of lens through which I see the world. It's our way of seeing, interpreting, and valuing the world. Character is always, to some degree, based in narrative. That is, the stories we tell and retell about who we are and what constitutes our character are the things that ultimately become who we are. Now, we may tell, and usually we do tell stories. We tell stories that whenever somebody asks who we are, frequently we fall back not on, here are my characteristics, I have brown eyes, I have red hair, here are my statistics. But when people really want to know who we are, people who are trying to become our friends, what we do is we tell them stories. We tell them stories about our best friends. We tell them stories about our wonderful grandparents. And we tell them stories about our family traditions. And these stories are the conduits to who we really are. When we talk about goodness and evil, we generally begin to tell stories. And that's why this course focuses on case studies, because case studies are really stories, and stories draw us in and make us think through a situation, make us place ourselves in that situation, and really help us to, in so many ways, almost relive a situation in our imaginations. Often these are stories a community tells and retells. And in fact, a number of the cases in this class are cases that are told and retold in business ethics textbooks and in business ethics courses around the country and really around the world. These are case studies that have become, in so many ways paradigmatic. They have become paradigm cases that are told and retold. Sometimes we live in a variety of communities that have different and even competing stories. So a lot of us belong to a lot of different communities. We belong to the community at DePaul University. We belong to a family community. We belong to a community of friends. And in fact, we may have a number of different friends who each draw us into a different kind of community. We also have communities in association with our high schools where we came from. We have communities of our hometown or hometowns where we've come from. So all of us live out of not just a story from a small community somewhere. We usually are telling many different stories in many different ways. And some of us probably even have religious communities. And out of those religious communities, we probably have received some moral formation. We have received at least some of our ethics from that religious tradition. Most of what we see does not lie before our eyes, but behind them, where we interpret these images to fit into a framework of meaning. I wanted to stress this right at the end because conscience and character are developed in such a way that, and this goes back to something I was saying just about 5 minutes ago, conscience and character become the lenses through which we see the world and understand it and morally judge it. And it's important to see, to recognize that when we view the world, especially when we're viewing it from a moral perspective, we're not viewing it from some kind of objective and purely neutral standpoint. We're seeing it through certain lenses, and those lenses have been cut, and they have been refined, they have been tinted through the years by these various communities that we belong to, these various stories we have embraced, and these various influences and formative influences of friends and authority figures and others. But those are some of the most important aspects of conscience and character, is that they are lenses through which we see the world, and these lenses are constantly being formed and reformed. For any of you who are wearing glasses, you probably have that experience where, every few years, you have to go back to the doctor and they have to give you a new prescription. They have to be formed and reformed in a much similar way, a very similar way. Our conscience is being formed and reformed all the time, hopefully being refined in a good way that helps us see our world better for what it is. That's it for this week. See you next week.